A few years back, I was living in a studio apartment. It wasn't the kind of place you'd describe as cozy, or even tolerable for that matter. The ceiling leaked when it rained, and the walls seemed to absorb the shouts of my neighbors like they were made for nothing else. I spent my days in a state of fog, feeling like the walls had somehow grown taller and the air denser. My mind was a spinning wheel, caught between the monotony of a dead-end job and the gnawing fears that this might be it, that life had nothing else to offer. The days blurred into nights, and the only thing that separated them was whatever distraction I could cling to. I'd spend hours staring at the screen, hopping from one TV show to the next, like each episode could patch the gaping hole I felt inside. When the credits rolled and the silence of my apartment returned, I'd grab a book and dive in, desperate to avoid that quiet moment where my thoughts would creep back in, reminding me of everything I wasn't. Looking back, it feels ridiculous, almost comical in a sad way. I remember getting completely lost in The Lord of the Rings one winter. I'd tell myself I was just killing time, but the truth was, I wanted to live in Middle-earth. The stakes were clear there, good versus evil, heroes with noble quests, a fellowship bound by loyalty. None of it felt messy or confusing like real life. When Frodo's journey got too hard, Sam would appear with some comforting speech, and I'd cry, knowing I had no Sam of my own. I can't pinpoint when it started. Maybe it was when I lost my first real job and couldn't figure out how to explain that failure to my family. Or maybe it was earlier, when I realized that I didn't know how to be the person everyone expected me to be. Instead of facing that shame head on, I slipped into other worlds. Escapism became my way of surviving, not thriving, not even living, just surviving. And yet, I could never escape completely. Life has a way of creeping in no matter how deep you bury yourself. The rent notice on the door, the phone calls from friends I ignored, the nights when the loneliness felt like it was crushing my chest. These things would pull me out of my fantasy worlds, but not for long. I'd find some new series, a new story, something to sweep me away again. Escapism is the instinct to step away from reality, a temporary retreat from the weight of existence. The word comes from the Latin excapare, meaning to escape or break free. In the early 20th century, as industrialization reshaped daily life with long work hours and monotonous routines, people turned to books, films, and music for escape. But the impulse to withdraw from hardship isn't new. Ancient Romans crowded into the Colosseum for brutal spectacles, momentarily forgetting their struggles. Some thinkers saw escapism as a weakness. Jean-Paul Sartre argued it was a form of bad faith, a refusal to confront reality. Nietzsche warned that hiding an illusion could mean losing oneself entirely. Yet for others, escapism was a tool for survival. Viktor Frankl, who endured the horrors of concentration camps, described how prisoners mentally escaped by revisiting memories or imagining a future beyond their suffering. Today, escapism takes many forms: social media, binge watching, gaming, even substance use. It can be a healthy break or a dangerous crutch. Art is our chief means of breaking bread with the dead. W.H. Auden once wrote, "If stories and creative works allow us to connect across time, then perhaps escapism isn't about running away. It's about searching for meaning in places where life alone doesn't provide it. The question isn't whether we escape, but how. If it helps us return to life with new clarity, it serves a purpose. If it becomes a way to avoid life altogether, it turns into its own kind of prison." One of the most vivid memories I have is from a night when the power went out in the middle of a storm. With no distractions left, I sat there in the dark, surrounded by the muffled hum of rain and occasional car tires splashing through puddles outside. I felt the weight of my own thoughts for the first time in months, and it was unbearable. It wasn't that I was sad or angry. I was just empty, like a shell that had nothing left inside. For hours, I sat there thinking about how I'd gotten to that point, about the things I was avoiding, my stalled career, the friendships I'd let wither, the dreams I'd quietly abandoned. There was no epiphany, no sudden clarity, just the realization that escapism had been a band-aid, and the wound beneath it was still festering. That night, I wrote down a single question in a notebook I hadn't touched in years. What am I so afraid of? It was the first honest thing I'd asked myself in a long time, and even though I didn't have an answer, it felt like a start. It wasn't until years later that I began to see how deeply entrenched I had become in escapism. At first, it was just a distraction, a way to kill time, to avoid the more uncomfortable questions rattling around in my head. But over time, it became something else. It turned into a crutch, maybe even an addiction. I'd stay up late watching movies or reading books, immersing myself in the lives of others because mine felt hollow. Every time I returned to reality, it seemed even more uninviting than before. One night, I was rereading The Great Gatsby, a book I had loved in high school but hadn't touched in years. There's a moment in the book where Nick describes Gatsby staring out at the green light, that tiny speck across the bay that he's built his entire life around. It's such a quiet scene, but it's devastating when you think about it. This man who has everything, standing there in the dark, reaching for something he can never really touch. I don't know why it hit me the way it did that night, but I closed the book and just sat there staring at the wall. I realized I had been doing the same thing, maybe not with a person or a dream as specific as Gatsby's, but with this idea of how life was supposed to be. I kept clinging to this version of myself that didn't exist anymore, or maybe never existed at all. I wasn't chasing a green light, but I was definitely running from something. The hard part was admitting it wasn't working. Escapism had helped me cope when things felt unbearable, but it wasn't solving anything. If anything, it was making things worse. Every time I came back to reality, the problems I was avoiding had grown bigger, like shadows stretching out as the sun sets. Around that time, I started turning to philosophy, not because I was particularly intellectual, but because I was desperate. I wanted someone, anyone, to explain why life felt so hollow. I stumbled across Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and it completely flipped my perspective. Frankl survived the Holocaust, which is unimaginable to me, and yet he still found a way to believe in life's meaning. He wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." That line hit me hard. I had spent so much time wishing the world would change, wishing life would magically align with the stories I escaped into. But that's not how life works. The only thing I could change was me. It wasn't an epiphany that fixed everything overnight. I still spent nights binging TV shows or diving into novels to avoid my thoughts. But slowly, I started to approach escapism differently. Instead of using it to hide, I tried to let it teach me. I'd ask myself why certain stories moved me so deeply, or why certain characters stuck with me long after the credits rolled. Sometimes it was because they reflected something I was struggling with. Other times, it was because they showed me something I wanted to be. There's a balance, I think, between escaping and engaging. I started small, calling a friend I hadn't spoken to in months, talking around my neighbors. It felt awkward at first, like I didn't belong in the real world anymore. But the more I showed up, the more I realized how much I had been missing. You must live for other people if you wish to live for yourself. Seneca's words helped me make sense of it. I had spent so much time focused on my own pain that I'd forgotten how much joy there is in connecting with others. Escapism had been my refuge, but connection became my way back. Still, I don't think escapism is inherently bad. It's human. Life is heavy, and sometimes we need a break. But it's a tool, not a destination. When I think about the people I admire, writers, artists, even just friends who seem at peace with themselves, they're not people who reject escapism. They're people who use it to recharge, to make sense of life, and then return to reality with more clarity and courage. Now, I still escape from time to time. I'll lose myself in a book or a movie when life feels overwhelming, but I try not to stay there too long. The world isn't perfect. It's messy and uncomfortable, and sometimes it's downright painful. But it's also where the good stuff happens. It's where we laugh with friends, fall in love, and discover things about ourselves we didn't know were there. Escapism can't replace that. It can only remind us why it matters.